They ignored you for weeks. Complete silence. No responses to your messages. No acknowledgement of your presence. No explanation for the sudden coldness. You felt confused, hurt, maybe even desperate for answers. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But what he did not explicitly say is that when others withdraw from us completely, when they ignore us so thoroughly that we feel invisible. You see, being ignored is not just a social experience. It is a psychological catalyst. It is the universe forcing you into what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, separate from the expectations and validations of others. And this process, though, when someone ignores you, your ego immediately goes into crisis mode. The ego, that part of your personality that interfaces with the external world, suddenly has no mirror to reflect itself in. It is like looking for your reflection and finding empty space. But here is where Jung's wisdom becomes profound. He understood that the ego is not your true self. It is merely the mask you wear, what he called the persona. During those first few days of being ignored, you probably experienced what Jung would recognize as the dark night of the soul. You questioned everything about yourself. Were you too much, too little? Too needy? This is actually the beginning of what Jung called the encounter with the shadow. The shadow is all the parts of yourself that you have rejected, denied, or hidden away because you believe they were unacceptable. Most people run from this encounter. They chase after the people who ignored them, trying to win back their attention, trying to prove their worth, trying to return to the comfortable illusion that external validation equals self-worth. But Jung believed that we cannot become whole until we integrate our shadow, until we accept and embrace all parts of ourselves, even the parts we have been taught to hide. Being ignored you started to notice things. How much of your energy you had been giving away, trying to maintain relationships that were one-sided. How often you had compromised your own values to keep others comfortable. This is what Jung called the process of individuation. Becoming an individual, becoming whole, becoming authentically yourself, rather than a collection of other people's expectations and projections. And individuation, Jung knew, is not a comfortable process. It requires you to stand. During those weeks of being ignored, something profound was happening in your unconscious mind. You were withdrawing your projections. Projection is a psychological defense mechanism where we attribute our own unconscious feelings, thoughts, or characteristics to others. When someone ignores us, we often project our own feelings of unworthiness onto them, assuming they see us as unworthy. You also began to understand what Jung meant when he said that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. The people who ignored you were not capable of receiving your authentic communication. They were relating to your persona, your mask, not to your true self. And when your true self, this is where Jung's understanding of the collective unconscious becomes relevant. The collective unconscious is the deepest layer of the unconscious mind, shared by all humanity, containing universal patterns and archetypes. One of these universal patterns is that when someone begins to individuate, when they begin to become truly themselves, the people who ignored you were in the second category. Your growing authenticity, your movement toward wholeness, triggered their own shadow material, their own fears of not being enough. But here is what they did not expect, and what you probably did not expect either. As you continued to individuate, your shadow and become more authentically yourself, you began to embody what Jung called the integrated personality. You became someone who no longer needed external validation. Jung understood that the most attractive quality a person can possess is not neediness or desperation for connection, but the ability to be complete within themselves while still being open to genuine connection with others. This is what you developed during those weeks of being. And then something interesting began to happen. The very people who had ignored you started to notice you again, but not in the way they had before. They began to sense something different about you, something they could not quite name but found compelling. You were no longer chasing their attention, no longer trying to prove your worth. This shift in your energy created what Jung recognized as a fundamental change in your relationships. When you no longer need something from others, when you are not trying to get them to fill a void within you, You become genuinely attractive, not because you are playing hard to get, but because you have people who ignored you began to reach out, not because you had won them back, but because you had become someone new, someone who no longer fit into their old categories, someone who challenged their assumptions about who you were and what you. But here is the most surprising part. By the time they came back, you had changed so fundamentally that their return did not affect you the way it would have before. You no longer needed their validation because you had. Jung believed that this is the ultimate goal of human psychological development, to become so complete within ourselves that we can engage with others from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. You discovered what Jung meant when he said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The weeks of silence had stripped away everything that was not essential. Everything that was not essential. Everything that was not authentically you. And individuation, Jung knew, is not just a personal achievement. It is a gift to the world. When you become authentically yourself, you give others permission to do the same. When you stop performing and start being, you create. The people who ignored you taught you something invaluable, though they probably did not intend to. They taught you that your worth is not dependent on their recognition, that your value is not determined by their attention, that your completeness comes from within. Not. Jung understood that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as losses, that sometimes what feels like rejection is actually redirection, that sometimes being ignored is the universe's way of forcing you to pay attention to yourself. The weeks of silence were not punishment. Now, when people ignore you, you understand it differently. You see it as information rather than rejection. You recognize that not everyone is capable of appreciating authenticity, that not everyone. You have learned to distinguish between people who want to distinguish between people who want to know your persona and people who want to know your soul. You have developed the ability to. The transformation that occurred during those weeks of being ignored was not just psychological, it was spiritual. You discovered what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox, to be both. You learned that the opposite of being ignored is not being chased or pursued. It is being seen and appreciated for who you truly are. And you can only be seen for who you truly are. The people who ignore you now are simply showing you that they are not your people. They are not capable of the kind of connection you are now available for. And instead of taking this personally, instead of making it mean something, Jung believed that we attract what we are, not what we want. When you were operating from neediness, from a sense of incompleteness, you attracted people who were also operating from that place. But now that you have individuated, now that you have become whole within yourself, you attract people who are also whole, people who are capable. The weeks of being ignored were not wasted time. They were the most productive weeks of your psychological and spiritual development. They forced you to develop the kind of relationship with yourself that makes all other relationships better. Jung said that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But he also understood that this transformation can only happen between two. Being ignored taught you to become that kind of person. It forced you to develop what Jung called a relationship with the self, the deeper, more authentic part of you that exists beyond the ego. You no longer tolerate being ignored because you no longer need constant attention to feel secure. You no longer chase people who pull away because you understand that their withdrawal says more about their capacity for connection than it does about your worth. You no longer take other people's behavior personally. The surprise ending to being ignored for weeks was not that those people came back, though many of them probably did. The surprise was that by the time Jung knew that finding yourself, becoming individuated, developing a relationship with your authentic self, is the greatest achievement of human life. Everything else, the people who ignored you gave you an unexpected gift. They forced you to turn inward, to develop your inner resources, to discover your own completeness. They pushed you into individuation whether you wanted to go there or not. And individuation, though challenging, is always. So the next time someone ignores you, remember this story. Remember that their silence might be the universe's way of creating space for you to hear your own voice. Remember that their withdrawal might be the catalyst you need to discover your own completeness. Remember that what Jung's final wisdom on this matter was simple but profound. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Being ignored forces you to do exactly that. It strips away the external mirrors and validations and forces you to find your reflection in your own soul. And when you do, when you accept yourself completely, you become the kind of person who the weeks of silence were not the end of your story. They were the beginning